This is the story of Mrs. Agnes Penrose and the secret that changed the fate of the world. Chapter 1. The envelope from Whitehall. The morning the envelope arrived, the sea was hidden beneath fog, a thick, unmoving shroud that made the village of Brindleford-on-Sea seem half forgotten by the world. From her small cottage window, Mrs. Agnes Penrose could barely see the lamppost outside. Its light floated in the mist like a ghost's lantern, pale and uncertain. She had risen early, as she always did, to boil water for tea and feed the stray cat that visited her doorstep. It was an ordinary ritual, quiet and dependable, until the knock came. 3 taps, firm and deliberate, the sort that carried authority. When she opened the door, a postman in a grey coat stood there, his cap beaded with fog. "Special delivery, Mum," he said, holding out a brown envelope sealed with red wax. "From London, Whitehall office," it says. Mrs. Penrose blinked. "From Whitehall. For me, yes, ma'am, requires your signature." Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote her name. The postman tipped his hat and vanished into the mist, leaving her alone with the envelope, thick, official, and unsettlingly heavy. For a long moment, she only stared at it. It had been 2 years since the war ended. 2 years since her husband, Captain Thomas Penrose, had not come home. His file was marked missing, presumed dead. And though she'd received his medal, his photograph, and his final notice, there had never been an explanation, only silence. Now, perhaps, there would be one. She carried the envelope to her small writing table beside the window. The fall pressed softly against the glass. The ticking clock filled the quiet room. With careful fingers, she broke the seal. Inside was a letter, typed in formal tone. "Dear Mrs. Penrose, we regret to inform you that certain personal effects belonging to the late Captain Penrose have been recovered during a recent file reorganization at the War Office. They are enclosed here for your keeping. Kindly acknowledge receipt. Office of Records, Whitehall." She unfolded the wrapping. Out slid a small leather diary, the color of old chestnut, its edges frayed, its clasp bent. On the cover were embossed initials, K.M. Mrs. Penrose frowned. Her husband's initials were T.P. Beneath the diary lay a folded page of thin, foreign paper, a letter written in slanted handwriting she couldn't read. At the bottom, a signature, Carl Meissner. She read the first line aloud, slowly, sounding out the words. "Sie werden es Krieg nennen, obwohl wir nur wollten. Das der Fried scheitert." Her German was faint, but enough remained from her school-teaching days to catch the meaning. "They will call it war, though we only wished peace to fail." She sat very still. The words echoed strangely in the little room. Who was Carl Meissner? And why was his diary among her husband's effects? Outside, the church bell tolled 8. By midday the fog had lifted, revealing a pale sky washed clean by salt and wind. Mrs. Penrose wrapped the diary carefully and walked to the village library. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and seaweed. Children played marbles by the post office wall, their laughter sharp against the quiet streets. The librarian, Miss Fairler, greeted her with a smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Penrose. You've brought something new to read." "Something to translate, rather," she replied, placing the letter on the desk. "It's in German. I can manage a little, but I'd value your help." Miss Fairler adjusted her spectacles and leaned over the page. "Let's see. Sie werden es Krieg nennen. Yes, they will call it war, though we only wanted peace to fail." She looked up, puzzled. "That's a curious line. Rather fatalistic, don't you think?" "Indeed," said Mrs. Penrose softly, "and the name at the bottom, Carl Meissner." Miss Fairley's brow furrowed. "That rings a bell. Wait." She crossed to a shelf and returned with a thick register of wartime personnel. She flipped through pages, her finger running down lists. "Yes, Meissner, Karl Friedrich, diplomat, attached to the German embassy in London until 1938, declared missing the following year. Mrs. Penrose felt the faint chill of connection. A German diplomat in London the year before the war began. Strange company for a British captain. Miss Fairler murmured. Yes, said Mrs. Penrose, staring at the initials again. Very strange company indeed. That night, the sea returned, whispering softly beyond the dunes. Mrs. Penrose sat beside her lamp, reading the first pages of Meissner's diary. The ink had faded, but his tone was precise, the careful voice of a man used to diplomacy and caution. London, February 1938. The air here smells of coal and pride. The English smile and pretend not to listen, yet they hear everything. I have been told peace is safe, but peace feels brittle, like a glass pane ready to break. Page after page described meetings in Whitehall, notes exchanged, corridors filled with rumours. Meissner mentioned a codebreaker from Brindleford who translated, intercepted communiques. She felt her heart tighten. Her husband had been a codebreaker, and Brindleford was not a large place. March 3rd. The Englishman warned me tonight. He said war is not desired but required. I asked him, required by whom? He smiled and said, by those who cannot live without an enemy. Mrs. Penrose closed the diary. Her hands were cold. The clock struck 10. She rose, moved to the window, and looked out toward the sea. The tide was high, the moon thin as a blade. Somewhere out there, ships had once gathered, engines whispering toward battle. But what if, she thought, the war had not been the storm everyone claimed? What if it had been arranged? She thought of Thomas, of his patient eyes and quiet intelligence, of the secrets he could never share. Was this one of them? The cat mewed softly at her feet. She bent to stroke its fur, her voice little more than a breath. If only the dead could explain themselves. As she straightened, something slipped from the diary, a second scrap of paper, folded small. She opened it under the lamp. In English this time, her husband's handwriting unmistakable. A promise kept will be mistaken for betrayal. Burn after reading, her breath caught. The flame of the lamp trembled in the glass. Outside, the fog began to roll in again, swallowing the stars one by one. That night, long after the village had gone to sleep, Mrs. Penrose sat alone at her desk. The diary lay open, the letter beside it. She felt as though the war had not truly ended, that its shadow had merely changed shape. She whispered into the quiet room, almost a prayer, who wanted peace to fail, and why. Then, as the wind stirred the curtains and the tide sighed beyond the cliffs, she reached for her pen and wrote the first words of her own investigation. The truth begins where the orders end, and thus began the mystery of the war that shouldn't have happened. Chapter 2. The Diary of Karl Meissner. Rain fell softly over Brindleford-on-Sea the next morning, a patient, whispering drizzle that blurred the rooftops and washed the colour from the world. Mrs. Agnes Penrose stood by her cottage window, the diary open beside her teacup, watching the rivulets run down the glass like lines of unreadable writing. She had hardly slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the initials KM pressed into the leather cover and the single chilling sentence, "They will call it war, though we only wished peace to fail." Now, in daylight, the words seemed even stranger, less poetic, more deliberate. A statement, perhaps, or a confession. She turned another fragile page. April 1938. Met again with B&P, both convinced that a small crisis is necessary. They call it a correction of history. I call it madness. The initials meant nothing yet, but she wrote them carefully in her notebook. B.P. On her kitchen table, the steam from her kettle mingled with the cold air drifting in from the cracked window. The war was over, yes, but the questions it left behind were like ashes that refused to scatter. At 10 o'clock she locked the diary in her handbag and set off toward the library once more. Her shoes tapped quietly on wet cobblestones. The sea lay somewhere beyond the mist, muttering to itself like an old conspirator. Miss Fowler was dusting shelves when Mrs. Penrose entered. "Back so soon?" the librarian asked, smiling. "You've caught the translation bug." "You might say that," said Mrs. Penrose. "Do you know anyone who kept records of the German embassy staff before the war? Someone who might recall a man named Karl Meissner?" Miss Fowler pursed her lips in thought. "There's old Mr. Latham used to be a clerk in the Foreign Office, lives near the station. He's a bit deaf now, but remembers everything he ever typed. Or so he claims." "Then he's exactly the man I need," said Mrs. Penrose. She thanked her friend and took the tram to the edge of town. The rain had grown heavier. Droplets rattled on the roof like fingers drumming secrets. Mr. Latham lived in a narrow brick house filled with clocks. Every wall ticked, every shelf ticked, the air itself seemed to measure time. He was a wiry old fellow with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Meissner, you say?" he repeated when she gave the name. "Ah, yes." The German fellow who spoke better English than half our diplomats. Polite, precise, always carried an umbrella. Vanished just before Munich, as I recall. Did he have friends in Whitehall? "Oh, several. Kept close company with certain peace planners, as they called themselves. Thought they could steer history by clever talk." He gave a dry chuckle. "History doesn't steer, my dear, it drags." Mrs. Penrose leaned forward. "Do you recall anyone with the initials B or P?" "B." He rubbed his chin. "There was a Brigadier Brooke, Edward Brooke, and a Mr. Parker, from intelligence, both frequent visitors to Meissner's office, if memory serves. Brooke, the same name from the photograph in her husband's trunk." The circle was tightening. "Thank you, Mr. Latham, you've been very kind." He smiled vaguely. "Tell me, madam, why the sudden interest in ghosts?" She hesitated, then said softly, "Because some ghosts never stopped influencing the living." That evening, Mrs. Penrose spread her notes across the kitchen table. The lamplight trembled on the page like candlelight in a church. Thomas, Meissner, Brooke, Parker. The names formed an unseen pattern, like constellations glimpsed through fog. The diary provided only fragments, but fragments could be dangerous. She read on. May 1938. Dinner at Carlton Club. Englishman bespeaks of a secret understanding and accord to prepare for the storm they believe must come. He says peace makes nations soft. I told him softness is another word for mercy. He laughed. Mrs. Penrose closed the book, heart heavy. She could almost hear that laughter echoing across the years. If B was indeed Colonel Brooke, then her husband had once worked beside a man who helped design something called the Accord. She went to the mantel and looked at the photograph of Thomas in uniform, gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the faintest trace of humour on his lips. "What were you doing, my dear?" she whispered. "Protecting your country or building its sorrow." The cat leapt onto the armchair and curled there, purring like a distant engine. Outside, the church bells rang the half-hour. Unable to rest, she put on her shawl and stepped into the damp evening. The village smelled of rain and chimney smoke. The sea's roar blended with the sigh of wind through telephone wires, a single unending note. She found herself walking toward the church, drawn by its lighted windows. Inside, Father Benedict Shaw was arranging hymn books. He looked up with quiet surprise. "Mrs. Penrose, what brings you out on such a night?" I needed. "Clarity," she said, shaking the raindrops from her scarf. "You once served as chaplain during the war, didn't you?" I did. "Too much confession, not enough absolution," he replied gently. "Sit, please." She told him cautiously about the diary, the diplomat, the missing colonel. He listened without interruption, fingers folded. When she finished, he said softly, "There are many kinds of sin, Mrs. Penrose, some born of greed, others of conviction. The latter are the hardest to repent. You think they believed they were doing right?" "I think," he said, looking toward the dark nave, that men often mistake foresight for righteousness. She considered this. Then what should one do with the truth, Father, when it harms the peace the world has barely found? He smiled softly. Ah, that is a question for the saints or the storytellers. Back home, she dried her hair by the fire and stared again at the diary. The rain had eased. The ticking clock marked each passing second with faint insistence. She turned to the final entry, and before the pages changed handwriting entirely from Meissner's measured German script to her husband's familiar English cursive. June 1938. The accord signed in secret. We tell ourselves it will avert catastrophe. But peace feels heavier each day, as though waiting to break. Below it, in Thomas's neat hand, if we succeed, history will never know our names. If we fail, history will invent others to blame. The fire hissed. Mrs. Penrose pressed her hand to the page, feeling the faint ridges of his ink. Somewhere within these lines lay the explanation for everything: the war, his disappearance, and the silence that followed. But she also sensed the warning in his words: truth and ruin often arrive together. Still, she whispered to the empty room, I must know. She blew out the lamp. The sea murmured beyond the dunes, timeless, unwatchful. And as she drifted toward an easy sleep, a single question echoed like a heartbeat in the dark. If peace was meant to fail, who ensured it did? Chapter 3. The Whisper Network. The next morning broke pale and tired, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over Brindleford-on-Sea. Mrs. Agnes Penrose sat at her breakfast table, stirring tea she had already forgotten to drink. The diary of Karl Meissner lay open before her, its pages marked with slips of paper and pencil notes. The previous night's discoveries had not left her mind for a single moment. The entry about the accord replayed like a quiet refrain. Each time she thought she understood it, new questions appeared like mist on glass. Who were these men who believed they could manage peace and war? And what part had her husband played among them? She folded the diary shut, slipped it into her satchel, and reached for her coat. The only person who might help her read between such lines was Eleanor Drayton, her old university friend, sharp-minded, discreet, and once a secretary in the Foreign Office during the late 1930s. London -1947, the train from Brindleford rattled northward through grey countryside. Wet fields flashed past the window, hedgerows dissolving into rain. Mrs. Penrose watched her reflection in the glass, an aging woman in a dark hat, eyes alert but weary. She still carried herself like a teacher, composed and unhurried, but her thoughts were a storm beneath the surface. At Paddington Station, London felt heavier than she remembered. The city was still rebuilding scaffolds, rising like skeletons from bombed-out ruins, posters urging patience and unity, children skipping beside ration queues. The war had ended, but its echo lived in every brick and face. Eleanor's flat stood near Bloomsbury, above a small bookshop that smelled of dust and pipe smoke. When Mrs. Penrose knocked, the door opened to reveal the same bright eyes she remembered from years ago, though now framed by silver hair and fatigue. Agnes Penrose, Eleanor said warmly, you haven't aged a day. Well, perhaps a thoughtful day or two. Mrs. Penrose smiled faintly. And you're still armed with sarcasm. Coming before I make tea. Or perhaps something stronger. They sat in a modest sitting room by the grey light of London noon. Piles of papers covered the sideboard. Eleanor's research for the National Archives, she explained. When the tea arrived, Mrs. Penrose unfolded the letter and diary excerpts. Eleanor read silently, brows rising. My word, she murmured after a long pause. Karl Meissner. I haven't heard that name in years. He was a curious figure, one of those diplomats who knew too much and trusted too few. So you knew him. I typed 2 of his briefings. He was ... different. He said the world was being steered toward a storm it could still avoid, but no one wanted to change course. He once told me, peace is not profitable, Miss Drayton. It has no investors. I thought it melodramatic at the time. Mrs. Penrose looked down. He worked with a Colonel Brooke, didn't he? Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes. And your husband Thomas was in correspondence with them, wasn't he? I remember his name in one of the coded memos we intercepted during the crisis of 38. You know, Agnes, there were whispers even then that certain departments were adjusting intelligence, making threats appear larger than they were. Why? To speed the inevitable. They feared complacency. Thought if they frightened the government enough, they could force rearmament, strengthen alliances, prevent a larger disaster, she sighed. They believed they could control the fire by lighting it themselves. Mrs. Penrose closed her eyes briefly, and instead, they burned the world. The clock struck 3. The sound felt heavy in the small flat. Eleanor looked at her old friend kindly. You've opened a door that was meant to stay locked. Be careful, Agnes. The files about that period aren't all public, and some who handled them still walk the corridors of power. Mrs. Penrose smiled faintly. I'm only a retired teacher from the coast. Hardly a threat to Whitehall. Eleanor leaned closer. That's what makes you dangerous. No one suspects the quiet ones. When evening fell, the two women walked together through the drizzle toward the National Archives Annex. The building loomed like a sleeping beast of stone and glass, its windows glowing faintly. Inside, Eleanor showed her how to request access under the guise of a personal record inquiry. Within an hour, Mrs. Penrose held in her hands a grey folder marked Restricted, Correspondence Meissner, K Embassy attach. Most of it was routine, trade reports, travel visas, harmless letters. But near the bottom she found a carbon copy of a telegram dated August 1939, just before the war began. Its final line had been torn off, but the remaining text made her skin prickle. 2. Recipient unlisted. Delay the trains. It begins at dawn. Eleanor read over her shoulder. It begins at dawn. She whispered, Good Lord. That could mean anything or everything. Mrs. Penrose folded the copy carefully. My husband's name appears nowhere, but I can feel his presence in these pages. He was there, Eleanor, somewhere in the shadows of these words. They left the archives near dusk. The streets shimmered with rainlight. Lamps flickered to life one by one. The city hummed softly, a tired giant nursing its secrets. As they reached the bookshop corner, Eleanor paused. Agnes, if you find what you're looking for, what will you do with it? Mrs. Penrose looked up at the wet sky. I don't know. Perhaps I only wish to understand the man I loved. Eleanor hesitated, then said, Just remember, truth doesn't always heal. Sometimes it infects. The two friends embraced briefly before parting. Back in her small London hotel, Mrs. Penrose dried her raincoat by the radiator and laid the diary on the bedspread. Outside, the rain continued a steady whisper against the glass, like the soft voice of history repeating itself. She reread the telegram, the torn line, the cryptic sentence. Somewhere between those words lay the beginning of the end. Then she noticed something she hadn't before on the inside cover of the diary, faint pencil indentations. She tilted the lamp sideways and rubbed a soft pencil across the surface. Letters emerged slowly, ghost-like. The Accord Room 12, Clarendon Club, the 11th of June 1938. A date, a place, the start of it all. She sat back, heart steady, but mind racing. The Clarendon Club still existed. She recalled a private establishment for retired officers and government men, only a few streets from Parliament. Perhaps someone there still remembered. Perhaps the walls themselves remembered. She closed the diary and looked toward the window. Rain reflected the city lights in streaks of silver and gold. In that moment, she felt the weight of history pressing gently on her shoulders, neither cruel nor kind, simply watchful. The whisper network, she realized, had never truly dissolved. It merely changed its language, from telegrams and briefings to silence and forgetting. But she would not forget ... As the clock struck midnight, Mrs. Penrose wrote in her small notebook, Tomorrow, Clarendon Club. The truth hides best among gentlemen. Then she switched off the lamp, letting the city's dim glow fill the room, half-remembered dream. Outside, somewhere beyond the fog, the bells of St. Paul's began to toll. Each chime sounded like a question, waiting 70 years to be answered. Chapter 4. The Missing Telegram. The next morning dawned colourless, a wash of London grey that seemed to dissolve all boundaries between sky and stone. The city was damp and quiet, as though still half asleep after the long rain. Mrs. Agnes Penrose stepped from her small hotel, her gloved hand resting lightly on her handbag inside it. Carl Meissner's diary and the copied telegram that ended with the haunting words, "Delay the trains, it begins at dawn." She took a slow breath of cold air and turned toward St. James's, where the Clarendon Club stood behind high iron gates. The club was old, discreet, and built of red brick darkened by time. To most passers-by it looked like another relic of empire, a place for polished shoes, cigars, and private laughter. But to Mrs. Penrose, it was the last living witness to a secret meeting that might have altered the course of the world. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and smoke. Portraits of admirals and statesmen lined the walls, their painted eyes fixed forever on unseen horizons. A porter in a green waistcoat looked up from his desk. "Good morning, madam, members only, I'm afraid." Mrs. Penrose offered a calm smile. "I'm here researching for a historical piece on the club's wartime activities. I was told I might speak with someone from the 1930s staff, perhaps a records officer." The porter hesitated, glancing at her sensible hat and composed manner. Something about her tone, polite but steady, carried quiet authority. "One moment, madam." He disappeared down the corridor. Mrs. Penrose waited, studying the framed photographs near the desk. One caught her attention, a 1938 banquet, silver cutlery gleaming, rows of gentlemen seated beneath the Union Jack. Among them, unmistakable, was Colonel Edward Brooke, his narrow face caught, mid-smile, and next to him, just visible at the edge of the frame, a man with round spectacles, Thomas Penrose. Her breath caught. The porter returned, followed by a stooped elderly man with a notebook tucked under one arm. "Mrs. Penrose, I'm Mr. Ridley, keeper of the archives. You're interested in our pre-war gatherings?" "Yes," she said, steadying her voice. "Specifically, a meeting on June 11, 1938, a private dinner sometimes referred to as the Accord." Ridley frowned faintly. "That's an old ghost awake, madam, but come along." Some minutes were kept, though never officially. He led her through corridors lined with ticking clocks to a small records room smelling of dust and leather. From a cabinet, he drew a folder labeled 1938 Private Functions. Within were typed attendance lists, receipts, menus. She turned the brittle pages until she found what she sought: the Clarendon Club, private dinner. June 11, 1938. Guests: Meissner, K. Brooke, E. Parker, J. Penrose, T. Her husband's name was there, clear as daylight. Ridley spoke softly. "Strange evening, that one. Security men everywhere, and not a reporter in sight. My predecessor said they argued over the price of peace as though it were wine." Mrs. Penrose traced her gloved finger over the names. "Was any telegram sent from the club that night?" He blinked. "Telegram? None that I recall, though we did have a private line installed in the library. It was removed before the Blitz." She thanked him and copied the list carefully into her notebook. As she turned to leave, Ridley added quietly, "Mrs. Penrose, sometimes the past is best treated like dynamite. Handle it gently." Outside, the rain had returned, thin and whispering, like static from an old wireless. She stood beneath the portico, watching the streetcars glide through puddles, her mind assembling fragments into an easy shape. If the Accord had gathered those four men, it wasn't to debate diplomacy over dinner. They were planning something, a signal, a message, Perhaps the very telegram that ended in that final chilling phrase, "Delay the trains, it begins at dawn." But what was to begin? And why delay the trains? That afternoon, she made her way to Whitehall, carrying a letter of introduction Eleanor had quietly prepared for her. The War Records office was a vast marble labyrinth, its corridors echoing with the footsteps of clerks who never looked up. At the reference desk, she presented her letter. "I'm tracing a civilian communication intercepted in August 1939, file reference 71B. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, adjusted his spectacles. "One moment, madam." He vanished between shelves and returned with a thick folder wrapped in twine. "Partial contents only, I'm afraid. The rest was classified for destruction after 46. She untied the cord and opened the file. Inside were fragments, copied cables, station logs, and half-decoded transmissions. Among them, a faint carbon slip bearing Meissner's name, and the word accord stamped faintly in purple ink, but at the bottom, just as before, the crucial line had been torn clean away. "Is this all?" she asked. "I'm afraid so," said the clerk. "That telegram went missing during the war. Rumor says it was taken by a codebreaker for personal safekeeping." Her pulse quickened. "A codebreaker. Do you know his name?" The clerk shook his head. "Records show only initials, TP. Mrs. Penrose closed the file slowly. The rain on the windows blurred into pale streaks of light. That evening, she sat alone in her hotel room, the city a low murmur beyond the glass. The diary, the photograph, the telegram, all pieces of the same puzzle. She laid them side by side on the coverlet. The pattern was clearer now. 4 men, 1 secret dinner, 1 vanished message. She opened the diary again, scanning Meissner's meticulous handwriting. Near the back, a short entry dated June 12, 1938. "The Englishman delivered the code personally. It must not be traced. Should peace fail, history will absolve the necessary lie." Her hand trembled slightly. "The necessary lie," she whispered. What lie could justify a world at war? The room felt smaller, filled with invisible company, the echoes of men who had once believed they were shaping destiny. She remembered her husband's note, tucked within the diary. "A promise kept will be mistaken for betrayal." Had he tried to stop them, or had he helped them succeed? Later that night, she walked to the embankment, the Thames sliding darkly under the lamps. The wind off the water was cold, carrying the faint tang of metal and memory. Across the river, the government buildings rose like stone sentinels. So many windows, each holding its own secret. She whispered into the mist, "Thomas, what did you do?" Her reflection wavered on the surface of the river, divided by ripples of light. For the first time since the envelope had arrived, she felt something more than grief. She felt the weight of complicity. When she returned to her room, a small envelope waited on the floor, slipped under her door. No name, no seal, only the faint scent of tobacco. Inside, a single card bore 5 typed words. "Ask the priest about Brooke." Her hand tightened around it. Father Benedict Shaw, her old friend in Brindleford. Someone knew she was searching. Someone wanted her to continue, or to stop. She placed the card beside the diary, extinguished the lamp, and sat listening to the distant city until the sound of rain became the sea once more in her imagination. Endless, whispering, ancient. As she drifted toward an easy sleep, one thought repeated itself, soft as the rain on glass. Truth doesn't vanish. It hides where faith begins. Chapter 5. The man in the photograph. The train rattled softly through the night as Mrs. Agnes Penrose returned to Brindleford-on-Sea. London, with its smoke and whispers, had left her weary but restless. She sat by the window, her gloved hands folded over the diary in her lap. Outside, moonlight swept across empty fields and silent signal posts. Her thoughts circled the message that had awaited her at the hotel. Ask the priest about Brooke. The name had haunted her, since she'd found it beneath her husband's photograph. Colonel Edward Brooke, the man who smiled faintly beside Thomas in the Clarendon Club portrait. The man who had vanished at Dunkirk and was presumed dead, but the message suggested otherwise. And if he was alive, then perhaps the ghosts she chased were flesh after all. The following morning, the sea was calm. Brindleford's church tower stood like a sentinel above the mist, its bell tolling the half-hour. Mrs. Penrose walked the cobbled lane towards St. Jude's Church, her coat drawn tight against the salt wind. Father Benedict Shaw was polishing the brass candlesticks when she entered. He looked up and smiled, his kind eyes shining in the dim light. "Mrs. Penrose," he greeted softly, "back from London already?" "I feared the city might keep you longer." "It nearly did," she replied, setting her handbag on the pew. "I've been following a thread, Father, one that began with an envelope and now leads to a man named Brooke." The priest's hands paused on the candlestick. "Brooke," he repeated, his tone neutral. "That name belongs to a restless ghost, so he is dead, then?" Father Shaw hesitated, then gestured toward a pew. "Sit, my dear. Some truths require stillness." The church was cool and quiet. Through the stained glass, light broke into colors across the floor, crimson, blue, and gold drifting like breath. Father Shaw folded his hands. "I knew Edward Brooke before the war. He was not the type of man to rest easily, brilliant, proud, to certain of his own righteousness. During those dark years, he believed England was sleepwalking toward its doom. He and a few others thought they could force the country to act, to rearm, to prepare." "The Accord," said Mrs. Penrose quietly. The priest's head lifted in surprise. "So you've heard of it?" "I've read its shadow in the diary of Carl Meissner. He, Brooke, my husband, and a Mr. Parker met in secret. They spoke of orchestrating events to bring about what they called a necessary correction of history." Father Shaw sighed. "Yes, I was their confessor, unofficially. They called themselves patriots, though I warned them that playing God with peace would destroy them." He looked away, his voice lowering. "When Dunkirk fell, Brooke vanished. Everyone assumed he was killed. But one night, near the war's end, a letter arrived for me. No return address, only his handwriting." He rose, crossed to a locked cabinet, and returned with a small envelope, yellowed by years. "I have never shown this to anyone, until now." Mrs. Penrose took the letter carefully. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. Father Shaw, "If you read this, then the world has chosen war. We try to frighten men into peace, but fear grows only fear. Tell no one what we attempted. History will call it patriotism, and that is punishment enough. Tell Agnes Penrose her husband did not betray her. He betrayed only himself. E. Brooke." She read it twice, slowly, before looking up. "He knew my name. He knew about Thomas." Father Shaw nodded. "Your husband confessed to me once, before he left for France. He said he had joined the Accord to prevent war, but when he realized what they'd done, the signals, the false communiques, he tried to stop it. Too late." Mrs. Penrose's throat tightened. "And Brooke, he disappeared into exile. There were rumors he'd taken refuge in France under another name. I do not know if he survived the occupation." She folded the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. "Someone left me a message in London. They wanted me to find this." "Which means Brooke may still be alive." The priest's eyes darkened. "Or someone wants you to believe he is." That evening, Mrs. Penrose returned to her cottage. The air smelled of seaweed and rain. Gulls cried over the harbour. Inside, she lit a lamp and laid the letter beside her husband's photograph. The two men stared at her from the faded image, Brooke's confident smirk, Thomas's quiet gaze. She whispered to the picture. "He said you didn't betray me." "But what did you betray, Thomas? What secret did you both carry to your graves?" Her cat leapt onto the windowsill, tail flicking. Beyond the glass, The sky had turned a deep violet. She poured tea, opened Meissner's diary again, and turned to the next entry dated August 1939. Met with EB and TP at the Clarendon once more. The plan proceeds. Operation to commence before dawn should Berlin refuse negotiations. Englishman insists delay of trains is essential. He fears bloodshed will expose the deception too soon. Mrs. Penrose's heart beat faster. Delay the trains. The phrase again, the line that had haunted every clue. She rose abruptly and went to her husband's old trunk by the hearth. Inside lay medals, notebooks, a fountain pen, and a small wooden box she had never been able to open. 4 years, it had been sealed with a rusted lock. Now, desperate, she pried it open with a thin knife. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth, lay a photograph, the same Clarendon Club scene she had seen earlier, but this time uncropped. 4 men sat at the long table, and between them lay a document embossed with a small seal, a dove within a circle of flames. On the back of the photograph, her husband's handwriting read, "The accord, to prevent or preserve." She stared at it, her breath shallow. The question was rhetorical, yet damning. To prevent war or to preserve it? Which had they done? Beneath the photograph, a folded slip of paper bore faint numbers and words. Room 12, Beacon's End, Friday midnight. Beacon's End, the abandoned coastal bunker north of Brindleford, used by the Home Guard during the war, a place she hadn't thought of in years. Rain lashed the window as she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. The idea of venturing out into the storm had frightened another woman, but curiosity burned stronger than fear. She tucked the note into her coat pocket, extinguished the lamp, and stepped into the night. The path to Beacon's End wound along the cliffs, slick with rain and sea spray. Her lantern cast a trembling halo on the whetstones. The wind hissed through gorse bushes, carrying the far-off moan of the tide. When she reached the bunker, its iron door hung crooked, rusted hinges creaking. She lifted the lantern high. The corridor beyond smelled of salt and decay. And on the far wall, drawn in chalk, she saw the same symbol from the photograph, the dove within flames. Beneath it, someone had scrawled a single word, "Remember." She stepped closer, her lantern flickering. Something glimmered beneath the chalk, a brass plate bolted to the wall. She wiped away grime and read the inscription, "The accord, to prevent or preserve." Her husband's question, carved in metal. A gust of wind roared through the entrance, nearly extinguishing her lantern. She turned sharply, but the darkness beyond was empty. Still, she could not shake the feeling that someone had been there moments before her. She left the bunker, just as thunder rolled over the sea. The rain softened to a mist, and dawn began to pale the horizon. When she reached her cottage, a single envelope waited beneath her door, damp but legible. Inside, a note typed in the same machine font as before. The accord was never dissolved. Meet the survivor, tomorrow. 10 p. in the old post office. Mrs. Penrose set the note down carefully. Her heart was calm, not with fear, but with purpose. For the first time, she knew the mystery was not about what had happened to the world, but because of it. She looked toward the sea, grey and endless, and whispered to the dawn, "Then let the truth come walking." Chapter 6. The Accord. The wind had turned restless again. All day it had hissed through the narrow lanes of Brindleford-on-Sea, rattling windows and stirring the smell of the tide into every house. By nightfall, the storm had grown into a low, ceaseless hum that blended with the sea's own breathing. Mrs. Agnes Penrose sat at her writing desk, the lamp throwing a soft amber circle around her notes. The mysterious message from the night before lay in front of her. The accord was never dissolved. Meet the survivor, tomorrow, 10 p.m. the old post office. She had read it a dozen times. Every letter seemed to pulse with intent, as if the paper itself wanted to speak. The next evening, at 10 minutes to 10, she stood before the old post office, a squat stone building near the edge of the village green. It had been shuttered since 1943, when the bombs began to fall. A single lantern flickered by the door, its light playing across the faded words Royal Mail and Telegraphs. She drew her coat tighter and listened. The wind had dropped. Only the slow crash of waves filled the silence. Then, footsteps. From the darkness emerged a man, tall but slightly stooped, wrapped in a heavy coat. His hair was white, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He carried himself like someone who had once commanded attention and had long since learned to avoid it. "Mrs. Penrose," he said softly. "I wondered if you would come." Her breath caught. "You're Colonel Edward Brooke." He gave a weary nod. "Once. These days, names are a burden." They stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and damp paper. Shelves still lined the walls, stacked with yellowed envelopes and rusted tins. In the center stood a small table and 2 wooden chairs. A candle burned between them. "I was told you were dead," she said. He smiled faintly. "I was. Officially, I chose to remain so." "Why contact me now?" "Because you're the last one left who still asks why." He gestured for her to sit. His hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, and for a moment she saw the ghost of the officer he once was, precise, contained, haunted. "I know you've read Meissner's diary," he began. "Then you already know the shape of it, but you don't yet know the cost." He stared into the candle flame as he spoke. In 1938, the government refused to believe war was coming. Too many wanted to keep their comfort, trade, appeasement, speeches about peace. A few of us believed the delay would doom us, so we created a network, the Accord. We gathered intelligence, forged cables, made the threat appear greater than it was. We hoped to frighten Parliament into action. Mrs. Penrose's voice was quiet. "Fear is medicine." "Precisely. A dose of terror to save the patient." He laughed bitterly. "But medicine becomes poison easily. The lies spread faster than we imagined. When war came, it was not the deterrent we planned. It was the consequence." He drew his cigarette, smoke curling like ghosts around the candlelight. "Your husband, Thomas, joined us to keep an eye on the deception. He was the only one who questioned it aloud. Meissner trusted him more than anyone. When Thomas realized our false reports were being used as justification for invasion, he tried to stop them, to delay the transmission that would ignite the chain." "The telegram," whispered Mrs. Penrose. "Delay the trains. It begins at dawn." Brooke nodded. "Yes, that was his final act, a warning, not a command." But the line was cut before he could send the rest. The message reached Berlin. Incomplete. It was interpreted as confirmation, not caution. Her hand went to her mouth. So the war began because a man tried to prevent it. The candle guttered. Rain whispered against the roof. For a long time neither spoke. The truth lay between them like a wound, open, quiet, irreversible. At last Mrs. Penrose said softly, "Why come forward now, after all these years?" Brooke's eyes met hers. "Because I am dying, and I have grown tired of silence. History records heroes and villains, but never the fools who stood between them." He took a folded envelope from his coat and slid it across the table. "This is your husband's last note. He left it with Meissner, who kept it hidden. After Meissner was executed in Berlin, it found its way to me." Her hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable, firm, neat, unmistakably Thomas. "My dearest Agnes, if this reaches you, know that I tried. The lie became larger than any of us. I chose to send the truth, though I knew it would be misunderstood. They will say I caused it. They will be right. But the war that follows may yet awaken those who slept. Forgive me for the noise the world will make. Yours, always, T." The words blurred through her tears. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her heart. Brooke spoke again, his voice roughened by age and regret. "He was the best of us. the only one who acted out of conscience, not ambition. When the truth twisted against him, I let the world believe he'd died a hero. It was the least I could do. Mrs. Penrose looked up at him, calm now, her grief tempered by understanding. You said the accord was never dissolved. What did you mean? He hesitated, then said, the machine we built, the network of influence, secrecy, manipulation, it never stopped. It simply changed its name, its country, its purpose. The world thrives on managed truth. You see it in every speech, every broadcast. So the lie continues, she murmured. Yes, he said, his gaze distant, and it always will. Because peace is fragile, and fear is useful. A crash of wind burst through a broken window pane. The candle wavered, then steadied. Brooke rose slowly. I've told you all I can. The rest belongs to memory, and to you. Where will you go? He smiled faintly. Where men like me belong, into the footnotes. He reached for her hand. Tell his story, Mrs. Penrose, but tell it softly. The world sleeps better believing in heroes. Then, with a quiet nod, he turned and disappeared into the storm. Mrs. Penrose remained seated long after he had gone. The candle burned low, the room filled with the slow drip of rain through the roof. She opened her husband's letter again, tracing each line as if it were written upon her own heart. Through the open door she could see the sea beyond the green, dark, infinite, whispering against the cliffs. She thought of all the voices buried beneath that sound, the lost, the liars, the well-meaning, the guilty. Finally she whispered, You tried to stop it, Thomas, and that is enough. She folded the letter and placed it in her bag beside Meissner's diary. As she stepped out into the night, the candle went out, leaving only the glow of the lantern outside. The wind had softened, dawn would come soon. Far off across the horizon, lightning flickered once, a faint echo of a war long ended, or perhaps merely beginning again in memory. Mrs. Penrose turned toward home, her steps slow and steady. The sea breathed behind her like something ancient and forgiving, and somewhere within that sound, she could almost hear her husband's voice, calm, certain, at peace. The truth begins where the orders end. Chapter 7. The Confession of Colonel Brooke. The storm had passed by dawn. Brindleford-on-Sea lay washed and silent beneath a sky of cold pearl light. Puddles filled the cobbled lanes, reflecting the church tower, the shop fronts, and the slow rising smoke from breakfast fires. Mrs. Agnes Penrose did not sleep that night. She sat by her window, wrapped in her shawl, her husband's final letter resting on her lap. The ink shimmered faintly in the lamplight, as though the words themselves still breathed. At first, she thought the night's meeting at the post office had ended everything. Brooke had spoken, confessed, vanished. But just before dawn, as she drifted into a light doze, she had heard footsteps outside, deliberate, hesitant. A knock followed, 3 soft raps. When she opened the door, Colonel Brooke stood there again, soaked to the bone, his hat in his hands. The first pale light of morning fell across his face, revealing a man who looked suddenly very old. I couldn't leave, he said simply, not yet. She brought him inside, lit the fire, and poured tea. The kettle hissed as rainwater dripped from his coat to the hearth. Brooke sat heavily in the armchair opposite her. For a long while, he said nothing, watching the steam curl from his cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, the voice of a man who had practiced silence too long. I lied to you, Mrs. Penrose, he said. Not about your husband, but about myself. I told you I was a survivor. That's not true. I'm the cause. She looked at him gently. You mean the accord? I mean the lie that gave birth to war. He drew a small envelope from his coat and placed it on the table between them. The paper was creased and brittle. On its face was stamped Whitehall, confidential, 1939. This, he continued, is the original telegram your husband tried to stop. The one he rewrote. "The one I countermanded. You should read it." Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the page. 2. Embassy, Berlin, confirm mobilization delay. Peace efforts require 48-hour extension. Await directive before dawn. At the bottom, in a second, darker hand, Brooks, were the words that changed everything. Delay the trains. It begins at dawn. Mrs. Penrose raised her eyes slowly. You changed his message. He nodded once. The government refused to act. I believe that one clear signal, one apparent provocation, would force them to choose. I thought the false alarm would wake the sleeping lions. Instead, it started the fire I meant to contain. His hands shook as he pressed them to his temples. Do you know what it is to be obeyed, Mrs. Penrose? To speak a sentence and watch men die because of it. The room was utterly still, save for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. She set the telegram down carefully. And all these years, you lived with that knowledge. Yes, hidden behind medals, behind silence, behind the comfort of being forgotten. I became a ghost before my body ever allowed it. He leaned forward, staring into the fire. Your husband, Thomas, understood before or any of us that truth cannot be controlled. He begged me to withdraw the operation. When I refused, he tried to send his own correction through the code line. But by then the cables were compromised. His signal reached Berlin half intact, and so, when dawn came, both armies moved. His voice faltered. He didn't just die for his country. He died for my arrogance. Mrs. Penrose reached across the table and placed her hand lightly on his. The gesture surprised him. It had been years since anyone had touched him with forgiveness. He died believing he had tried to stop it, she said softly. And perhaps that's the only peace any of us ever find, knowing we tried. Brooke closed his eyes. You're kinder than I deserve. Kindness, she replied, is not absolution. It is understanding, outside. The village slowly woke. The clatter of milk bottles, the whistle of the baker's boy, the creak of bicycles on wet pavement, the sounds of a world that had moved on, unaware of the ghost drinking tea in a cottage by the sea. Brooke straightened, drawing breath as though preparing for confession in a chapel. There's more. The accord was never a single meeting or code. It became a habit, a philosophy. It lives still in ministries, in councils, in every secret justification wrapped in the language of duty. That's what I meant when I said it was never dissolved. He took from his coat another paper, folded into a narrow strip. I kept one page, the founding note of the accord. It was written not by me, nor Meissner, but by a politician whose name you would recognize if I said it aloud. He hesitated. I won't. The dead can't defend themselves, and the living won't understand. He unfolded the page and read aloud. Peace is a luxury of the untested. Conflict is proof of civilization's vigor. To preserve mankind's strength, peace must fail from time to time, by necessity, if not by chance. He crumpled it in his hand and let it fall into the fire. The paper caught instantly, curling into black ash. There, he whispered. The last remnant burned. The wind moaned faintly around the eaves. The fire hissed. For a moment, Mrs. Penrose thought he looked almost peaceful, as though the telling itself had lifted a stone from his chest. What will you do now? She asked. He smiled faintly. Leave you this, and vanish properly, this time. I've written a full account, but it will never see daylight. I want you to have it. If someday the world grows wiser, perhaps it can bear to read it. He handed her a small notebook bound in black leather. Everything is inside, names, dates, intentions. The true history of how peace was lost. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and if I publish it, then I will be remembered as a villain. But perhaps, he said quietly, a useful one. They spoke little after that. The fire burned low, the morning grew brighter, and the smell of salt drifted through the cracked window. When she rose to refill the kettle, she turned and found him gone. The chair stood empty, the door slightly ajar. On the table, beside his untouched cup, lay his officer's insignia, the small brass dove within a ring of flames. She smiled faintly through her tears. "The accord," she murmured, "to prevent or preserve." Outside, gulls wheeled above the cliffs, their cries lost in the wind. That evening, she walked to the churchyard. The sea stretched silver beneath, the sunset, calm now after days of storm. She carried Brooke's insignia and her husband's letter, placing them side by side at the base of the memorial cross. "Both of you tried to serve peace," she whispered. "Perhaps that is enough." The last light touched her face, soft and golden. In that moment, she no longer felt haunted, only connected, as though truth itself had finally exhaled. As the tide rose, she turned for home. The world, she thought, would continue to write its own comfortable fictions. But somewhere in her desk lay the quiet, terrible truth, the diary, the telegram, the confession. And that was her burden now. She would not destroy it. She would not reveal it. She would keep it safe, as one keeps a match away from a sleeping child. And in the deepening twilight, as she reached her gate, she heard her husband's voice again, not from the grave, but from memory, steady and warm. "The truth is not a weapon, Agnes, it is a flame. And even a small flame must be handled with care." She smiled faintly, the wind lifting her hair. The sea breathed against the cliffs, eternal and forgiving. And with that, Mrs. Penrose closed the door to her cottage, leaving the world, for now, to its sleep. Chapter 8. The Shadow in Whitehall, London, February 1948. The city was thawing from a long winter, the frost retreating reluctantly from iron railings and stone steps. Coal smoke hung low in the air, mingling with the damp scent of the Thames. Life had begun again, but only just irrational lines still formed, and the faces in them bore the same quiet entrance that had carried England through the war. Mrs. Agnes Penrose stood outside Whitehall, her gloved hands folded neatly around a small black satchel. Inside were 3 items: the diary of Karl Meissner, the telegram altered by Colonel Brooke, and the Colonel's leather-bound confession, a record of the secret that had reshaped the world. She had promised herself she would never come here again. Yet promises were like paper. They burned easily in the heat of conscience. A grey-uniformed clerk stopped her at the entrance. "Business, madam." A grey-uniformed clerk stopped her at the entrance. "Business, madam." "I've been asked to deliver a private research file to the records department," she said evenly. A continuation of correspondence regarding pre-war intelligence cables. The clerk glanced at her credentials, borrowed, neatly typed by Eleanor Drayton, whose quiet influence at the National Archives had not waned. With a short nod, he waved her through, inside. The corridor smelled of ink, polish, and the faint, metallic tang of secrecy. Brass plaques gleamed under weak electric light: Foreign Affairs, Defense Liaison, Historical Review. Each name felt like a closed door in her mind. In the records room, she found Eleanor waiting beside a trolley of cardboard boxes. Her old friend's hair was pinned in a hurried knot, and her sharp eyes flicked toward the door before softening. "You came," said Eleanor, keeping her voice low. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I should," replied Mrs. Penrose. Eleanor gestured toward the boxes. "These are the remaining transcripts from the 1938-39 communications file. Most were slated for destruction after the reorganization, but a few survived. I've kept them off the books." Mrs. Penrose opened the first folder carefully. Inside were fading carbon copies of diplomatic telegrams, most routine, a few redacted. Then she saw it, a familiar stamp in violet ink, Accord, faint but unmistakable. Her pulse steadied. "It's still here," she whispered. "They never erased it completely." Eleanor nodded grimly. "No, the name is changed, of course. It lives now under the title Committee for Strategic Stability. Different men, same belief. that peace must occasionally be broken to preserve order. Mrs. Penrose felt the chill of recognition. Brooke was right, it never dissolved. Agnes, Eleanor said quietly, you must be careful what you seek. There are files even are not permitted to touch, whole sections missing, and not from time, but design. Then I need to see the design, she said firmly. Who ordered these falsifications? Who benefits from the silence? Eleanor hesitated. There's one name that appears repeatedly. Under Secretary H.C. Warwick. He oversaw intelligence coordination of the transition. Still in service, still influential. His office is on the 3rd floor. Mrs. Penrose closed the folder. Then I shall meet him. The corridor outside felt colder now. She climbed the marble steps slowly, aware of the echo of her heels, the sound of intrusion disguised as purpose. On the 3rd floor, a brass plate read, H.C. Warwick, Under Secretary for Foreign Analysis. The door was ajar. Inside, a man in his 60s sat behind a wide oak desk, reading under the green shade of a banker's lamp. His suit was immaculate, his expression mild and unreadable. When he noticed her, he smiled the careful smile of a man who already knew her name. Mrs. Penrose, he said smoothly. Do come in. We've been expecting you. She froze. Expecting me, indeed. Word travels quickly when someone begins turning over ashes best left cold. His tone was courteous, almost kind, but his eyes were sharp, the eyes of someone accustomed to control. I believe you've come into possession of certain sensitive materials, he continued. Items belonging to the late Colonel Brooke and a Mr. Carl Meissner. Mrs. Penrose said nothing. He gestured toward the armchair opposite him. You needn't worry. We've no interest in prosecuting widows or ghosts. Only in preserving what remains of order. Please, sit. Reluctantly, she did. Warwick folded his hands. I admired your husband. A fine mind, wasted on moral hesitation. You see, he and Brooke misunderstood something essential. Peace is not sustained by truth, Mrs. Penrose. It is sustained by narrative. The right story, told convincingly, can hold nations together. Her voice, when it came, was calm. And when the story is a lie, he smiled thinly, then it must be maintained all the more carefully. She met his gaze steadily. You speak as though conscience were weakness. It is, he said without hesitation. History is written by those who sleep soundly after necessary choices. You, however, do not strike me as someone who sleeps easily. No, she said softly, but I dream clearly. He leaned back, studying her with faint amusement. You intend to publish Brooke's confession, I suppose. You think the world deserves the truth. I think the world deserves understanding. And what if your revelation destroys that fragile understanding? What if it unravels the peace your husband died trying to preserve? Mrs. Penrose hesitated. For a moment, the room seemed to grow darker, as if his words carried weight enough to dim the lamps. Warwick's voice softened. You see, even now, you understand why we continue the work. The accord, or whatever you choose to call it, exists because chaos is patient. We simply make sure it sleeps. He rose, walking to the window. You may keep your papers, Mrs. Penrose, but understand this, every age requires its gardeners. Some prune truth to keep the garden alive. When he turned back, his expression was that of a teacher, addressing a stubborn pupil. Go home, forget this. The sea's quieter in Brindleford, let the dead rest. Outside, the late afternoon light had turned gold. Mrs. Penrose descended the steps slowly, the black satchel still pressed against her chest. The air felt heavy. The city to loud ... at the corner. Eleanor waited. You saw him, yes, and... Mrs. Penrose looked toward the river, where the last light rippled across the water. He believes peace is a story, one that must be told forever, even when the words are wrong. Eleanor's voice trembled. And you? Mrs. Penrose smiled faintly. I believe stories can change their endings. That night, In her small hotel room overlooking the Thames, she unpacked the satchel. She laid out the diary, the telegram, and Brooks' confession. The lamplight shimmered on the ink if the pages were breathing. Then she took out her own notebook, the one she had begun weeks ago. On the night she received the first envelope. On a fresh page she wrote, "The truth begins where the orders end." She paused, listening to the hum of the city beyond her window. Somewhere out there, unseen, the machinery of secrecy continued its work, tireless, efficient, convinced of its righteousness. But for the first time, she no longer felt small against it. She dipped her pen once more and wrote beneath the line, "If stories keep the peace, then let mine remind the world why it was lost." The clock struck midnight, outside. London's lamps flickered one by one, stretching, their reflections across the dark water. Mrs. Penrose closed the notebook gently and whispered, "Sleep now, world, but not too deeply." Chapter 9. The letter never sent. The morning after her meeting in Whitehall dawned with an uneasy stillness. The fog had rolled in from the river, soft and complete, muting every sound of London to a whisper. From her hotel window, Mrs. Agnes Penrose could see only the faint shimmer of light on the opposite bank, like a ghost of the sun that refused to rise. She had not slept. The conversation with Under-Secretary Warwick replayed in her mind like a sermon recited in reverse, smooth, persuasive, and wrong. "Peace is a story," he had said. "Truth must be pruned." She sat at the small writing desk by the window, the satchel open beside her. Before her lay the three relics of everything she had learned: Meissner's diary, Brooks' confession, and her husband's letter. Between them sat a single blank page. It would become either her confession or her silence. She began to write, to the editor of the Times. "You will not know my name, though my husband's may appear in forgotten lists of the war dead. I write not to accuse, but to remind. The war that ravaged our world did not begin in chaos. It was designed by those who feared peace more than they feared conflict." The words came steadily, her hand moving with a strange calm. She wrote of the accord, of the men who had tried to manipulate history, of how their noble intent had curdled into catastrophe. She described Meissner's hope, Brooks' guilt, Thomas's sacrifice. Her handwriting was neat, almost serene. There was no anger in it, only clarity. "The truth is simple. We built the fire to prove we could control it. And then, like children, we watched the world burn." When she finished, she read it aloud in a whisper. Her own voice sounded unfamiliar, older, softer, perhaps wiser. Outside, the bells of St. Paul's told the hour. She folded the pages neatly and slid them into an envelope. Her hand hovered over the flap, the glue cold against her fingertips. For a moment, she imagined the consequences: headlines, debates, denial, anger. Perhaps the truth would shake the foundations of government, or perhaps it would be dismissed, buried under bureaucracy. What if Warwick was right? What if truth was too fragile to survive among men who preferred comfortable illusions? She set the envelope aside and poured herself a cup of tea. The sound of the liquid striking porcelain steadied her. At 10 o'clock, there came a soft knock on the door. Eleanor Drayton entered, wrapped in her grey overcoat, eyes sharp despite sleeplessness. "You look as though you've been fighting ghosts all night," she said gently. "I have," Mrs. Penrose replied, "and they are most persuasive." Eleanor noticed the envelope on the desk. "Is that it?" Mrs. Penrose nodded. "The truth, as I know it." "And you're sending it?" "I don't know." They sat together in silence for a while. The city outside had begun to stir. Carriage wheels, footsteps, the hum of distant voices. Eleanor spoke at last. "When the war ended, I thought honesty had returned with peace. But now I think peace only survived because people stopped asking questions. You're asking them again." Mrs. Penrose smiled faintly. "And you think that's wise?" "I think it's human." Later that afternoon, they walked together toward the river. The fog had thinned, revealing bridges and barges gliding through the pale water. Mrs. Penrose carried the sealed envelope in her gloved hand. Up Waterloo Bridge, she paused, watching the current below. The Thames flowed dark and constant, indifferent to the history it carried in its depths. "When Thomas was alive," she said quietly, "he used to tell me that truth and mercy are twins, inseparable, though they rarely agree. Perhaps he was right. If I send this letter, mercy dies. If I burn it, truth dies. I cannot seem to save both." Eleanor looked out across the river. "Maybe you can save something rarer. Understanding." Mrs. Penrose said nothing. She slipped the envelope back into her handbag and turned away from the water. That evening, she returned to her cottage in Brindleford-on-Sea. The journey felt longer than usual, the countryside stretched thin by winter's greyness. When she stepped into her home, the familiar scent of salt and coal dust embraced her like an old friend. She lit the lamp, set her coat on the hook, and listened to the sea's murmur through the windows. Everything here was unchanged. The teacup on the table, the cat asleep by the hearth, the clock ticking faithfully on the mantel. Only she had changed. She took out the envelope and placed it beside the fire. For a long time, she simply stared at it. Brooke's final words returned to her. "Tell his story, Mrs. Penrose, but tell it softly. The world sleeps better believing in heroes." She leaned forward and whispered, "But must it always sleep?" The fire crackled, answering in tongues of orange and gold. She unfolded her husband's letter once more. The paper had grown fragile at the edges, but the ink was still strong. "I chose to send the truth, though I knew it would be misunderstood. The war that follows may yet awaken those who slept." She smiled faintly. "Even now, Thomas, you're still teaching me." Then, slowly, she lifted the envelope and held it over the flame. The edges caught, curling inward like autumn leaves. The handwriting disappeared first, then the words themselves, consumed by light. When it was done, she stirred the ashes gently with the poker until they mingled with the soot of ordinary fires. The next morning, she awoke to a clear sky, the first in weeks. The sea shone like glass, the gulls wheeled lazily overhead. She opened her window, letting the cold wind sweep through the room. On her desk, the remnants of the burned letter lay in a small bowl. She picked up her notebook, the one she had carried from London, and began to write again. "This is not for newspapers or governments. It is for those who will listen when the world grows quiet enough to hear again." She paused, then continued, "Truth does not need to shout, it waits. It survives in diaries, in forgotten drawers, in the memories of widows who once believed peace was certain. One day, someone will find these pages, and perhaps they will understand that every war begins not with a bullet, but with a story told so convincingly." She closed the notebook and placed it inside the old chest that held her husband's things. Then she walked to the door, breathing in the salt air. The church bells began to ring, clear, bright, forgiving. That evening, as dusk fell over Brindleford, Mrs. Penrose sat on the cliffs, watching the horizon fade into silver. Somewhere beneath those endless waves, the voices of the past murmured, Meissner's calm reason, Brooke's regret, Thomas's quiet courage. She spoke softly, as though answering them. The truth remains, even if no one hears it, and that, perhaps, is enough. The wind lifted her hair, carrying her words toward the sea. When she rose to leave, the last light lingered on the water like a memory that refused to die. Behind her, the cottage lamp glowed warmly in the dark, a single, steady flame. And as the waves folded into one another far below, the world, for the first time in years, seemed to breathe in peace. Chapter 10. The Lullaby of History. Spring came slowly to Brindleford-on-Sea. The gorse along the cliffs began to flower, small bursts of yellow against the grey stones, and the tide softened its winter roar to something gentler, a rhythm that seemed almost human, like a great heart breathing far beneath the world. Mrs. Agnes Penrose felt the change in the air long before she saw it. She noticed it in the light that lingered longer in the afternoons, in the sound of the schoolchildren returning to the green, in the way the church bell no longer sounded like morning, but like memory. Her days had become quiet again, too quiet, some might have said. But she had learned that quiet could hold a great deal, thought, gratitude, even forgiveness. Every morning she still walked to the post office, not the ruined one, where she had met Colonel Brooke, but the small rebuilt branch near the harbour. She never sent letters any more. She simply liked the sound of paper and stamps, the small proof that words still moved through the world. On those walks, she often carried a folded notebook in her bag, Brooke's confession and Meissner's diary now resting in her chest, locked away with her husband's belongings. The truth was safe, but not buried. One clear morning she stopped by the churchyard, where gulls wheeled. Above the worn stones, beneath the cross, the grass had grown tall around the names etched there: Thomas Penrose, Carl Meissner, Edward Brooke, none of them sleeping together in the same soil, yet somehow united by the same unfinished prayer. She knelt to clear the moss from Thomas's name, brushing it gently with her hand. "Do you hear them, my love?" she murmured. The children laughing again, the trains passing without fear. The war is finally only a shadow now. A small wind rose from the sea, lifting a lock of her hair and carrying her words away. She took it as an answer. That evening, she hosted tea for Eleanor Drayton, who had travelled from London for a visit. The kettle sang on the stove, while the cat circled the guest's chair, purring like a polite question. Eleanor looked around the cottage, smiling faintly. "You've made peace with the ghosts, then?" "Peace?" Mrs. Penrose stirred sugar into her cup. "Not quite, but we've come to an understanding." Eleanor leaned forward. "And the documents, in their place? They'll remain here until someone wiser finds them. You could have changed history, Agnes." She smiled gently. "History changes itself, Eleanor. It's like the tide, always returning, always washing away its own footprints." Eleanor sighed. "You always did believe in mercy." "I believe in rest," said Mrs. Penrose. "Mercy is just rest for the soul." They sat for a while without speaking, listening to the clock tick and the sea hum beyond the walls. When Eleanor left the next morning, she embraced her friend tightly. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Mrs. Penrose watched her walk down the lane until she disappeared into the morning light. Weeks passed. The village settled into its gentle rhythm, fishermen mending nets, children drawing chalk circles on the cobblestones, the lamplighter moving down the street at dusk. Yet sometimes, when the wind blew in from the east, Mrs. Penrose imagined she could still hear the echo of marching boots, the clatter of typewriters, the murmur of men who once believed they could command history. Those sounds no longer frightened her. They had become part of the sea's voice, reminders, not warnings. At night, before she went to bed, she often opened her window and looked out across the moonlit water. The world seemed vast again, ungoverned by secrets. One such night, she took up her pen and began the final entry in her own notebook, the chronicle of what she had learned. Her handwriting flowed with steady calm. "It is not for me to decide what the world should remember. It is only for me to witness what it forgot. The truth is not a sword to strike with, nor a crown to wear. It is a candle. And candles are meant not to burn the dark away, but to show us that the dark was never empty." She paused, listening to the waves beyond her window. The sea's hush seemed to echo her thoughts. If war begins with fear, then perhaps peace begins with listening. Not to governments, nor generals, but to the small sounds, the kettle boiling, a child laughing, the sea whispering to the shore. These are the things worth preserving. She signed it simply. Agnes Penrose, Brindleford-on-Sea, 1948. Then she closed the notebook, blew out the lamp, and let the dark return, gentle and familiar. Spring deepened into early summer, the gardens bloomed, and once again the world seemed almost innocent. Tourists came to the coast, taking photographs of the lighthouse and buying postcards of the cliffs. None of them knew that the woman who passed them on her morning walks had once held the quiet key to a truth capable of shaking nations. Mrs. Penrose did not need them to know. She had never sought recognition. She had sought understanding and found it. One afternoon she sat on her bench near the harbour, watching a group of schoolchildren release paper boats into the tide. The little vessels bobbed and turned, drifting toward the open water. A young boy approached her shyly. "Miss, do you think they'll reach France?" She smiled. "Perhaps, if the sea's kind." He nodded solemnly. "Mum says the sea remembers everything." Mrs. Penrose's eyes softened. "So it does, child. But it forgives, too." That night, the wind rose again. Not a storm, just the restless breath of the world. She stood by her window as rain began to fall, fine and silvery, washing the dust from the panes. Lightning flared far off over the horizon, and for a heartbeat the sea gleamed white, like a page being turned. Mrs. Penrose whispered to the darkness, "You see, Thomas, the world goes on." She thought she could almost hear his reply, tender and wry, the echo of the man she had loved. "Then let it, Agnes, let it go on." The thunder faded. She drew the curtains, settled into her armchair, and watched the lamplight flicker over the walls. On the table beside her lay a small clock, ticking softly, the sound of life continuing, precise and patient. She closed her eyes. Summertime after midnight, the rain stopped. The clouds drifted apart, revealing a clear sky strewn with stars. The tide whispered against the shore, slow and even, as though the world itself were breathing in sleep. In her cottage by the sea, Mrs. Penrose dreamed. She dreamed of her husband walking beside her along the cliffs, of Miss Serenity's piano, of Brooke sitting quietly by the fire. They were not ghosts anymore, only memories, softened by peace. The dream faded gently, like dawnlight spreading across the water. When morning came, the sky was flawless blue. The villagers found her seated in her armchair, her hands folded neatly over her lap, her expression serene. The fire had burned down to embers. On the table beside her rested an open notebook. Across the final page, written in a clear, steady hand, were the last words she ever penned. "The truth sleeps, as we all must, but it dreams of being found again." That night, the church bell tolled once for her, and the sea carried the sound farther than any sermon ever had. And so the story of Mrs. Agnes Penrose, the teacher, the widow, the keeper of history's quietest secrets, faded into the hush of waves and wind. But the notebook remained, locked away in her trunk, beside a photograph of 3 men, and a single brass insignia shaped like a dove in a ring of flames. One day, someone would find it, and when they did, they would read the story of the war that should not have happened, and of the woman who learned that sometimes peace is not the absence of truth, but its forgiveness. I am glad that you are still here. Please like the video and subscribe the channel if you like the video. Thanks for watching it.